Tank had displaced forward with his machine gun, setting up a new position that allowed him to support the assault while maintaining suppressive fire on enemy positions that hadn't yet been neutralized. The big SEAL moved with surprising grace for his size, his weapon never ceasing its methodical destruction of enemy cover. Parker continued his precision work from his elevated position, but now he was calling out enemy movements and coordinating the team's advance. His young voice was steady and professional as he provided real-time intelligence that allowed the other SEALs to anticipate enemy actions. Morrison reached the first fortified position, a sandbag machine gun nest that had been causing significant problems. The two Taliban fighters inside had been forced to keep their heads down by Tank's suppressive fire. But they were still dangerous. Morrison approached from the blind side, using hand signals to coordinate with Foster. The assault on the machine gun nest took less than 10 seconds. Morrison and Foster moved simultaneously, their actions perfectly coordinated through months of training together. The Taliban fighters never had a chance to bring their weapon to bear on the attacking SEALs. With the first position cleared, Morrison could see the entire tactical situation changing. The enemy's carefully prepared ambush was collapsing as the SEALs systematically eliminated key positions. What had started as a perfectly executed trap was becoming a rout. Rodriguez's element had reached the main enemy command position, a fortified bunker that controlled the southern approach to the valley. The chief's assault was methodical and devastating, using grenades and precise rifle fire to clear the position room by room. Within minutes, the bunker was silent. The mortar team that had been dropping shells on the SEAL's initial position suddenly found themselves under direct assault from Parker and Williams. The young SEAL had displaced from his overwatch position to support a flanking attack that caught the mortar crew completely off guard. The enemy's indirect fire support disappeared in a matter of seconds. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the sounds of gunfire began to diminish. The Taliban forces, faced with an assault they hadn't expected and couldn't stop, were beginning to break and run. Some tried to escape through the southern end of the valley, only to run into positions that Rodriguez had established during his flanking movement. Morrison keyed his radio for a situation report.
All Neptune elements, sound off. What's your status? Neptune 2, area secure.
No casualties, Rodriguez reported. Neptune 3, position consolidated.
All good here, Tank confirmed.
Neptune 4 through 7, all operational. Valley floor is secure, came the combined report from the other team members. Morrison allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Against overwhelming odds, in terrain that favored the enemy, his team had not only survived a perfectly planned ambush, but had turned it into a complete victory. The Taliban stronghold that had resisted coalition forces for over 2 years had been neutralized in less than an hour. But even as Morrison savored the tactical victory, he couldn't forget what had started this fight. Sergeant Torres had abandoned his post, leaving his soldiers leaderless at a critical moment. The Army observation team had maintained their professionalism despite their sergeant's failure, but the incident raised serious questions about the overall command structure. Morrison's radio crackled with transmissions from higher command, requesting status updates and casualty reports. Air support was finally arriving, but it was no longer needed. The SEALs had accomplished their mission and eliminated a significant enemy stronghold, using nothing but their training, their equipment, and their refusal to accept defeat. As Morrison looked around the valley that had been intended as their grave, he felt a familiar pride in his team. They had faced the impossible and made it look routine. The Taliban commander known as the Ghost was among the casualties, and his carefully constructed fortress was now nothing more than empty positions and abandoned weapons. But the mission wasn't over yet. There were still questions to be answered, and Morrison suspected that the most difficult part of this operation was still to come. 2 hours after the last shots were fired in the valley, Sergeant Mike Torres sat alone on a rocky ledge, 3 miles from the battlefield, staring at his hands. They had stopped shaking, but he could still feel the tremor in his chest, the rapid heartbeat that wouldn't slow down despite the relative safety of his position. His radio had been silent for the past 30 minutes. The frantic calls for support, the desperate situation reports, and the coordination of air assets had all ceased. Either the SEALs were dead, or they had somehow accomplished the impossible. Torres wasn't sure which outcome would be worse for his conscience. The sound of approaching helicopters broke through his isolation. 2 Blackhawks were heading toward the valley. flying low and fast. Medical evacuation, Torres thought. Someone had survived the ambush, but how many? The guilt that had been building in his chest intensified as he considered the possibilities. Torres had served with distinction for 8 years. He had never abandoned his post, never left soldiers under his command, never run from a fight. But something about this mission had been different from the start. The intelligence had felt wrong, the timing had seemed off, and his instincts had screamed warnings that he should have listened to more carefully. But instincts didn't excuse cowardice. Orders didn't disappear because a soldier got scared. And leadership responsibilities didn't vanish just because the situation became difficult. Torres knew that every principle he had sworn to uphold, every value that had defined his military career, had been abandoned when he walked away from that ridge. His radio suddenly crackled to life with a transmission that made his blood freeze. Overwatch 6, this is Neptune Leader. What is your current position? Lieutenant Commander Morrison's voice was calm and professional, showing no signs of stress or injury. Torres grabbed his radio with hands that began shaking again, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. How could he explain where he was or why he had left his post? Overwatch 6. This is Neptune Leader. I say again, what is your current position? We need to coordinate extraction. The word extraction hit Torres like a physical blow. The SEALs had survived. Not only survived, but succeeded well enough to be planning their departure from the valley. While Torres had been running away from the fight, Morrison and his team had somehow turned a death trap into a victory. Torres forced himself to key the radio. Neptune Leader, this is Overwatch 6. My position is approximately 3 clicks northeast of primary observation post. There was a long pause before Morrison's voice returned. Roger, Overwatch 6. Stand by for further instructions. The tone was neutral, professional, but Torres could hear something underneath it. Not anger. Morrison was too disciplined for that, but there was a coldness that hadn't been there before, a distance that spoke volumes about what the SEAL commander thought of sergeants who abandoned their posts. 20 minutes later, Torres heard the sound of someone climbing the rocky slope below his position. He turned to see Martinez approaching, followed by Johnson and Patterson. His soldiers' faces were unreadable, but Torres could feel their judgment in the way they looked at him. Sergeant, Martinez said quietly, Lieutenant Commander Morrison wants to see you.
Torres nodded, unable to trust his voice.
He gathered his equipment and followed his soldiers down the slope, feeling like a condemned man walking to his execution. The weight of his rifle, which had always been a comfort, now felt like an accusation. The extraction point was a small clearing about a mile from the valley. As Torres approached, he could see the SEAL team waiting near the landing zone, their equipment packed and ready for departure. Every man was accounted for, standing tall and alert. There were no stretchers, no wounded soldiers being treated by medics. Lieutenant Commander Morrison stood apart from his team, studying a tablet that displayed tactical information from their operation. He looked up as Torres approached, his gray eyes taking in every detail of the Army sergeant's appearance. Sergeant Torres, Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years in special operations. Walk with me. They moved away from the other soldiers, far enough to speak privately, but close enough that both units could observe their conversation. Morrison's manner was controlled, professional, but Torres could sense the anger burning beneath the surface. I need you to explain to me why you abandoned your post during an active combat operation, Morrison said without preamble. And I need you to explain why your soldiers were left without leadership during a critical mission. Torres had rehearsed answers during his long wait on the ridge, but now all his prepared explanations seemed hollow and inadequate. Sir, the morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged Afghan mountains as Sergeant Mike Torres adjusted his radio headset for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. His hands trembled slightly, a detail he hoped the rest of his squad wouldn't notice. At 26, Torres had been in the Army for 8 years, but nothing had prepared him for what intelligence reports were saying about this particular valley. The briefing room had been unusually quiet the night before. Colonel Harrison had stood at the front, his weathered face grave as he pointed to satellite images on the screen. The valley they were discussing looked peaceful enough from above. a narrow stretch of rocky terrain surrounded by towering peaks. But according to their sources, it housed one of the most sophisticated Taliban strongholds in the region. "This isn't your typical cave system," the colonel had explained, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Intelligence suggests they've been fortifying this position for over 2 years. We're talking about reinforced bunkers, interconnected tunnels, and enough firepower to hold off a battalion." Torres had felt his stomach tighten as the details emerged. The Taliban commander in charge of this stronghold was known as the Ghost, a former Afghan military officer who had defected and taken his tactical knowledge with him. Under his leadership, this valley had become a launching point for attacks across 3 provinces. No coalition force had successfully penetrated its defenses. The mission was straightforward on paper: a joint operation between Torres's Army Reconnaissance Unit and a SEAL team to gather intelligence on the stronghold's capabilities and weaknesses. But Torres knew that missions rarely went according to plan, especially in terrain like this. As his unit moved through the pre-dawn darkness toward their insertion point, Torres couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. "How did you survive?" The intelligence said there were 40 fighters in prepared positions. "I saw the ambush being set up. I counted the weapon positions myself." Morrison's expression softened slightly, showing a hint of the professional respect that existed between soldiers who had faced combat together. Intelligence was accurate about the enemy's strength and positions. What intelligence missed was that we weren't planning to fight their battle. Over the next few minutes, Morrison outlined how his team had turned the ambush around. The decision to assault through the enemy's strongest positions, the coordinated flanking movements, the systematic elimination of key targets. It was a textbook example of how elite units could overcome seemingly impossible odds through superior training and decisive leadership. The Taliban commander had prepared for conventional tactics, Morrison explained. He expected us to try to escape or call for support. He didn't expect a direct assault by a team that refused to accept defeat as an option. Torres listened in growing amazement and shame as Morrison described the battle. While Torres had been running away in fear, the SEALs had been demonstrating exactly what separated elite warriors from ordinary soldiers. They had faced the same impossible odds, seen the same overwhelming enemy strength, but they had chosen to fight rather than flee. "What happens now?" Torres asked, though he already suspected the answer. Morrison's expression returned to its previous coldness. "Now you face the consequences of your actions. There will be an investigation, a formal hearing, and almost certainly a court-martial. Your military career is over, Sergeant Torres. The only question is whether you'll face criminal charges or just administrative separation." The words should have been devastating, but Torres found himself feeling something almost like relief. The uncertainty was over. He had made his choice on that ridge, and now he would face the results. There would be no more wondering, no more anxiety about what might happen. "I want you to understand something," Morrison continued. "My team succeeded today not because we're superhuman, but because we refused to quit when the situation became difficult. Every SEAL has faced moments of fear, uncertainty, and overwhelming odds. What makes us different is what we do with those feelings." Morrison paused, looking back toward his team. "Fear is normal. Doubt is human. But leadership means making the right choice even when you're scared, even when the odds are against you, and even when every instinct tells you to run." Torres nodded, finally understanding the full weight of his failure. It wasn't just about leaving his post or abandoning his soldiers. He had failed the most basic test of military leadership, choosing duty over personal safety when lives were at stake. The sound of approaching helicopters ended their conversation. The extraction birds were arriving, ready to take both units back to base. But Torres knew that while the SEALs would return as heroes who had accomplished an impossible mission, he would return as an example of what happened when leaders failed at the moment when leadership mattered most. As they walked back toward the landing zone, Morrison made one final comment. "Your soldiers performed admirably despite your absence. They deserve better leadership than you provided today." Torres watched as the SEAL team boarded their helicopter with the quiet professionalism that marked elite units. There were no celebrations, no dramatic gestures, just soldiers who had done their job under impossible circumstances and were ready to do it again whenever called upon. Martinez approached Torres as they waited for their own extraction helicopter. The young soldier's face showed a mixture of disappointment and concern that was somehow worse than outright anger would have been. "Sergeant, what happened up there?" Martinez asked quietly. "We needed you." Torres looked at his soldiers: Martinez, Johnson, Patterson, Williams, Thompson, and Rodriguez. Men who had trusted him with their lives and who had continued to perform their duties even when he had abandoned his. They deserved an honest answer. "I got scared," Torres said simply. "I saw how bad the situation was, and I ran instead of doing my job. There's no excuse for it, and I'm sorry." The admission hung in the air between them. His soldiers had known what happened, but hearing their sergeant acknowledge his failure directly was different than simply witnessing it. Some relationships, once broken, could never be fully repaired. The helicopter that would take Torres and his team back to base arrived 30 minutes later. As they flew away from the valley, Torres could see the aftermath of the battle below. Smoke still rose from several positions, and he could make out bodies scattered across the valley floor. The Taliban stronghold that had resisted coalition forces for over 2 years had been eliminated by 8 Navy SEALs who had refused to accept defeat. Over the following weeks, as Torres faced the formal investigation into his conduct, he would learn more details about the mission that had broken his nerve. The SEAL team had killed or captured 43 enemy fighters, destroyed a major weapons cache, and eliminated one of the most wanted Taliban commanders in the region. They had accomplished all of this with 0 casualties and minimal ammunition expenditure. The intelligence that had seemed so wrong to Torres had actually been remarkably accurate. The Taliban had been waiting for them, had prepared an ambush, and had possessed overwhelming tactical advantages. But what intelligence couldn't measure was the difference between soldiers who saw impossible odds as an obstacle and soldiers who saw them as just another challenge to overcome. The court-martial proceedings were swift and unambiguous. Torres pled guilty to abandoning his post during combat operations and was sentenced to reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and dismissal from service. His military career, which had spanned 8 years and included 2 previous combat tours, ended in disgrace. But perhaps the harshest punishment was watching his former soldiers continue their service without him. Martinez was promoted to sergeant and took command of the unit. Johnson, Patterson, and the others received commendations for their professionalism during the mission. They had all moved forward with their careers while Torres faced the consequences of one moment of cowardice. Lieutenant Commander Morrison submitted a detailed after-action report that praised the Army soldiers' performance while making clear recommendations about leadership requirements for future joint operations. He was careful to distinguish between the individual failure of one leader and the overall excellence of the Army unit. Months later, Torres would read newspaper accounts of the mission that described it as a textbook example of special operations success. The articles mentioned the intelligence value gained, the enemy casualties inflicted, and the strategic impact of eliminating the Taliban stronghold. What they didn't mention was the sergeant who had run away when his soldiers needed him most. The SEALs, for their part, returned to their base, conducted their debriefs, and prepared for their next mission. For them, the Valley operation was just another day at work, dangerous, challenging, but ultimately routine. They had faced impossible odds and prevailed because that's what they were trained to do. Torres eventually found work as a security guard at a shopping mall, a job that required no real responsibility and offered no opportunity for leadership. Every day, he was reminded of what he had lost and what his moment of cowardice had cost him. But he also carried with him a deeper understanding of what separated true warriors from ordinary soldiers. It wasn't superior equipment or better training, though both helped. It was the willingness to face fear, overcome doubt, and choose duty over personal safety when everything was on the line. The SEALs had proven that day that they couldn't be stopped, not by superior numbers, not by perfect ambushes, and not by impossible odds. They had shown that with enough skill, determination, and refusal to quit, even the most desperate situations could be turned into victories. Torres had learned the same lesson, but from the opposite perspective. He had discovered what happened when leaders failed, when fear overcame duty, and when personal safety became more important than the soldiers depending on that leadership. It was a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life, a reminder of the moment when he had been tested and found wanting. and of the 8 Navy SEALs who had faced the same test and proved they truly couldn't be stopped. The intelligence felt too convenient, too detailed. How had they suddenly acquired such specific information about a position that had remained hidden for years? His squad consisted of 6 soldiers, each hand-picked for their specific skills. There was Martinez, their communications specialist, whose calm demeanor under pressure had saved them more times than Torres could count. Johnson served as their medic, a soft-spoken man from Tennessee who could patch up anything from a scraped knee to a gunshot wound. The team's sniper, Patterson, rarely spoke but had never missed a shot when it mattered. The others, Williams, the demolitions expert, Thompson, their tracker, and Rodriguez, the heavy weapons specialist, rounded out a unit that had served together for over 18 months. They trusted each other completely, which made Torres's growing anxiety all the more troubling. A squad leader who couldn't trust his own instincts was a liability they couldn't afford. The helicopter ride to the drop zone was eerily quiet. Usually, the soldiers would joke around, trying to ease pre-mission tension. But something about this operation felt different. Even Martinez, who typically kept spirits up with his endless supply of bad jokes, stared silently out the window at the moonlit landscape below. The SEAL team they were supposed to rendezvous with was already in position, according to the radio chatter Torres monitored. Led by Lieutenant Commander Jake Reaper Morrison, the 8-man SEAL unit had a reputation that bordered on legendary. Morrison himself was a 20-year veteran who had seen action in Iraq, Afghanistan, and several classified operations that would never make it into official records. Torres had met Morrison briefly during the joint briefing, and the man's presence was immediately commanding. Tall and lean, with intense gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, Morrison spoke with quiet authority. When he outlined the SEAL team's role in the operation, every word was precise and purposeful. The plan called for Torres's unit to establish an observation post on the northern ridge overlooking the valley. From there, they would coordinate with the SEALs, who would infiltrate the valley floor to gather close-range intelligence. It sounded simple enough, but Torres's experience told him that simple plans often became complicated in a hurry. As their helicopter approached the drop zone, Torres ran through the mission timeline once more. They had a narrow window to complete their reconnaissance before enemy patrols became active. Intelligence suggested the Taliban forces in the valley operated on a predictable schedule, with most activity occurring during daylight hours when coalition air assets were less likely to operate. The helicopter touched down in a small clearing about 3 miles from their target. As Torres and his squad disembarked, the pilot gave them a thumbs up and mouthed the words they'd heard countless times before: "See you on the flip side." Within seconds, the aircraft disappeared into the night, leaving them alone in hostile territory. The trek to their observation post took nearly 2 hours. Thompson led the way, his natural tracking abilities allowing him to find safe paths through the rocky terrain. Every shadow could hide an enemy fighter. Every sound could signal an approaching patrol. Torres found himself jumping at noises that turned out to be nothing more than wind through the rocks. By the time they reached their designated position, the first hints of dawn were appearing on the horizon. Torres positioned his men strategically around the ridge, each with clear fields of fire and good concealment. Martinez set up the radio equipment they would need to coordinate with both the SEAL team and their command post. Through his binoculars, Torres got his first clear look at the valley below. What he saw made his blood run cold. The intelligence reports hadn't exaggerated. If anything, they had understated the enemy's capabilities. The valley floor was a maze of fortified positions, carefully camouflaged to blend with the natural terrain. Machine gun nests covered every approach, and Torres could see at least 3 mortar positions already manned and ready. But what really worried him were the details that intelligence had missed. The Taliban forces weren't just defending the valley, they were expecting visitors. Torres could see fighters taking positions that would be useless against an air attack, but perfect for engaging ground forces. The way they moved suggested recent training in counter-special operations tactics. "Command, this is Overwatch 6. Torres whispered into his radio, using his unit's call sign. "We have eyes on the target area. Threat assessment is significantly higher than briefed. Request permission to abort mission." The response came back immediately: "Negative, Overwatch 6. Mission is a go. SEAL team is already moving to insertion point. Torres felt his heart rate spike. Through his binoculars, he could see movement in the valley below. The Taliban forces were definitely aware that something was happening. Radio chatter increased, and Torres watched as additional fighters moved into defensive positions. His hands were shaking now, and not from the cold mountain air. Every instinct screamed that this was a setup, that someone had leaked their mission parameters to the enemy. The Taliban forces below weren't just ready for an attack, they were ready for this specific attack. Martinez crawled over to Torres's position, his face grim. "Sergeant, I'm picking up increased radio traffic from the valley. They know we're here." The words hit Torres like a physical blow. All his fears were being confirmed, but the mission was proceeding regardless. Somewhere in the darkness below, 8 Navy SEALs were moving toward what could only be described as a death trap. Torres tried to radio the SEAL team directly, but couldn't establish contact. Either they were maintaining radio silence as planned, or something had already gone wrong. The pit in his stomach grew larger as he considered the possibilities. As the sun climbed higher, the valley below became a hive of activity. Torres counted at least 40 Taliban fighters moving between positions, far more than intelligence had suggested. Heavy weapons were being repositioned to cover the most likely infiltration routes, and Torres could see what looked like improvised explosive devices being armed along several pathways. The professional soldier in Torres knew he should relay this intelligence to his command and trust that the SEALs could handle whatever they encountered. But the human being in him, the part that had seen too many good soldiers die because of bad intelligence, wanted nothing more than to grab his unit and get out of there before it was too late. His radio crackled to life. "Overwatch 6, this is Neptune Base. SEAL team has reached insertion point and is beginning infiltration. Maintain observation and report any significant enemy movement." Torres acknowledged the transmission, but his focus remained on the valley below. Through his scope, he watched as shadows moved along the valley floor. The SEALs were good useful even knowing where to look. He could barely make out their movement, but the Taliban fighters seemed to know exactly where they were. The first shots rang out just as Torres was updating his situation report. Muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions in the valley, and the distinctive crack of AK-47s echoed off the mountain walls. The SEALs had walked into an ambush. Torres's training took over, and he immediately began calling in the enemy positions he could identify. But even as he provided coordinates for potential airstrikes, he knew it might be too late. The volume of fire coming from the valley was overwhelming, and he couldn't see any sign of the SEAL team fighting back. All units, came the urgent voice over the radio. "Neptune team is taking heavy fire and requesting immediate extraction. All available assets converge on grid coordinates." The coordinates were for a position deep in the valley, surrounded by enemy fighters. Torres realized with growing horror that the SEALs weren't just pinned down. They were trapped in the worst possible position, with enemy forces on all sides and no clear escape route. His hands moved to his rifle almost unconsciously. Every fiber of his being wanted to help the trapped SEALs, but his orders were clear: maintain observation and avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary. Getting his squad killed wouldn't help anyone. But as the firefight intensified below and radio calls became increasingly desperate, Torres felt something inside him break. The weight of command, the responsibility for his soldiers' lives, and the knowledge that 8 elite warriors were fighting for their lives because of intelligence he should have questioned, it all became too much. Without saying a word to his men, Torres stood up from his concealed position and began moving back down the ridge, away from the valley and away from the fight. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else as he stumbled through the rocky terrain, his rifle forgotten in his hands. Behind him, he could hear Martinez calling his name, but the words seemed to come from very far away. The sound of gunfire from the valley grew fainter as he put distance between himself and the nightmare unfolding below. Torres had no clear destination in mind. All he knew was that he had to get away from the responsibility, away from the decisions that could get good soldiers killed. For the first time in his military career, Sergeant Mike Torres was running away from a fight. As he stumbled through the mountains, Torres's radio continued to crackle with desperate transmissions. The SEAL team was surrounded and taking casualties. Air support was still minutes away. His own squad was requesting orders that he was no longer there to give. But even as Torres fled from the sounds of battle, something was happening in the valley below that would change everything. The Navy SEALs, faced with impossible odds and no hope of easy rescue, were about to demonstrate why their reputation was built on more than just training and equipment. They were about to show what happened when elite warriors decided that surrender wasn't an option, even when facing certain death. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison pressed his back against the rocky outcropping as bullets whined overhead. The ambush had been perfectly executed, but that didn't mean it was over. Around him, his 7-man SEAL team had taken whatever cover they could find in the narrow valley floor, but their position was far from ideal. The intelligence had been wrong about everything. Instead of a lightly defended observation post, they had walked into a fortress. Instead of a few dozen Taliban fighters, they were facing what felt like a full company of well-trained enemy combatants. And instead of the element of surprise, they had found an enemy that had been waiting for them. Morrison's radio crackled with frantic transmissions from the Army observation post on the ridge above. The voice belonged to someone other than Sergeant Torres Martinez, if Morrison remembered the briefing correctly. The young soldier sounded scared, but was doing his job, calling out enemy positions as fast as he could spot them. "Neptune leader, this is Overwatch 2. Martinez's voice cut through the noise of gunfire. Sergeant Torres is no longer in position. I have tactical command of Overwatch unit. Morrison filed that information away for later consideration. Right now, he had more pressing concerns. Through the dust and smoke, he could see his men spread across roughly 50 meters of rocky terrain. Each was in cover, but their positions were scattered and communication was limited to hand signals. To his left, Petty Officer Marcus Tank Thompson had found shelter behind a boulder the size of a small car. The Big SEAL's machine gun was laying down suppressive fire, forcing enemy fighters to keep their heads down. But Morrison could see that Tank was running low on ammunition, and resupply wasn't going to be easy under the current circumstances. Chief Petty Officer Sam Rodriguez, the team's senior enlisted man, had taken position about 20 meters to Morrison's right. Despite being pinned down, Rodriguez was methodically working his way through targets with his rifle, each shot precisely placed. Morrison had seen Rodriguez work before. The man never wasted ammunition. The rest of the team, Petty Officers Jackson, Williams, Foster, and the newest member, Petty Officer Danny Kid Parker, were scattered between Morrison and Rodriguez. Each man was a specialist in his own right, but specialization meant nothing if they couldn't work together. The enemy fire was coming from at least 6 different positions, creating intersecting fields of fire that made movement extremely dangerous. Morrison could identify 2 machine gun nests, several rifle positions, and what sounded like at least one sniper working from an elevated position. The Taliban commander had positioned his forces perfectly to trap anyone foolish enough to enter the valley. What bothered Morrison most wasn't the tactical situation. He had been in worse spots before. What concerned him was how perfectly the ambush had been set up. The enemy had known exactly where to expect them, exactly which route they would take, and exactly how to position their forces for maximum effect. This level of preparation suggested either incredibly good intelligence or a significant security breach. But analysis would have to wait. Right now, Morrison needed to get his team out of this kill zone before the enemy brought up heavier weapons. Through his scope, he had already spotted Taliban fighters moving what looked like an RPG launcher into position. Morrison keyed his radio and switched to the frequency that would reach all his men simultaneously. Neptune team, this is Neptune leader. Sound off by numbers. Neptune 2, operational, came Rodriguez's calm voice. Neptune 3, good to go. Tank's deep rumble followed. Neptune 4 ready. Jackson reported from a position Morrison couldn't see. Neptune 5 standing by. Williams added, Neptune 6 operational. Foster confirmed. Neptune 7, ready to rock. Came Kid Parker's voice, younger than the others but steady. 7 voices. Morrison was relieved that none of his men had been hit in the initial volley, but he knew that wouldn't last long if they remained stationary. The enemy was already adjusting their fire, and it was only a matter of time before someone got unlucky. Neptune team, we're going to execute a rolling withdrawal toward the southern ridge. Morrison transmitted. Tank, I need you to lay down covering fire.
Rodriguez, take Jackson and Williams and bound back 50 meters. On my signal, Foster and Parker will move to support Tank's position. Questions. Neptune leader, this is Neptune 2. Rodriguez's voice came back immediately.
Southern route is blocked. I count at least 8 hostiles in elevated positions covering that approach.
Morrison cursed silently.
He had been hoping to use the southern ridge as an escape route, but if Rodriguez said it was blocked, then it was blocked. The chief had an uncanny ability to read terrain and enemy positions.
Roger, Neptune 2. What about the northern approach? Negative.
That's where most of the heavy fire is coming from. They've got us in a box.
A box.
Morrison had feared as much. The Taliban commander had positioned his forces to create what amounted to a kill zone, with no easy exits. It was a textbook ambush, executed with precision, that spoke of extensive training and planning. The sound of incoming mortars changed everything. Morrison heard the distinctive whistle of shells arcing overhead, and knew they had seconds before the enemy started dropping high explosives on their position.
The Taliban weren't content to simply pin them down. They intended to finish the job. All Neptune elements, mortars incoming. Take hard cover and prepare to move on my command.
The first mortar round hit about 30 meters from Morrison's position, showering the area with rock fragments and dust. The explosion was followed immediately by 2 more, each one closer than the last. The enemy mortar team was good. They were walking their fire across the SEAL's position with deadly precision. Morrison made a decision that went against every tactical manual he had ever studied. Instead of trying to escape the kill zone, he was going to turn his team toward the enemy and fight their way out through the strongest point of resistance. It was crazy, unexpected, and just might work.
Neptune team, new plan. He transmitted as another mortar round exploded nearby. We're going to assault through the northern positions. Tank, I need maximum suppression on the machine gun nest at grid 347892. Rodriguez, take Jackson and flank left. Williams and Foster, you're with me up the middle. Parker, you're our overwatch. Find high ground and start picking off targets.
There was a moment of silence on the radio. Morrison knew his men were processing what he had just ordered. A frontal assault against superior numbers in prepared positions was not standard SEAL operating procedure. But Morrison also knew that his team trusted his judgment even when that judgment seemed questionable.
Copy, Neptune leader, came Rodriguez's steady voice. Neptune elements 2, 4 and 5 moving to flanking positions. Neptune 3 understands. Suppressing northern MG position. Tank confirmed. Neptune 6 and 7, roger. Moving to assault positions. Foster and Parker acknowledged. Morrison felt a familiar calm settle over him as his team began to move. This was what they had trained for. The impossible situations where conventional tactics failed, and only audacity, skill, and teamwork could prevail. The fear and uncertainty of the ambush fell away, replaced by the focused clarity that came with decisive action. Tank's machine gun opened up with a steady rhythm, sending a stream of tracer rounds toward the enemy positions. The heavy bullets chewed through rock and wood, forcing the Taliban fighters to duck for cover. At the same time, Morrison could see Rodriguez leading Jackson and Williams in a wide flanking movement to the left, using every bit of available cover. Parker had found a position on a small rise that gave him a clear view of the valley. Morrison watched as the young SEAL's rifle began speaking in measured shots, each one aimed at a specific target. Within seconds, the volume of incoming fire decreased noticeably, as enemy fighters were forced to take cover or were eliminated entirely. Morrison and Foster began their movement up the center, using Tank's suppressive fire and Parker's precision shooting to bound forward from cover to cover. The key was timing, moving when the enemy was suppressed, taking cover before they could respond, and always maintaining forward momentum. The first Taliban fighter Morrison encountered was hiding behind a pile of rocks about 40 meters from his starting position. The man had been focused on Tank's position and didn't see the SEAL commander until it was too late. Morrison's rifle spoke twice, and the fighter went down without firing a shot. Foster was moving parallel to Morrison's position, his own rifle adding to the precision fire that was systematically eliminating enemy positions. The SEAL's movement was fluid and controlled, covering ground quickly while maintaining accuracy. Every shot was deliberate, every movement purposeful. On the left flank,
Rodriguez and his element were making steady progress against the enemy's strongest positions. The chief's tactical experience showed as he led Jackson and Williams through terrain that seemed impossible to traverse under fire. They used every fold in the ground, every rock formation, to mask their movement and close with the enemy. The Taliban fighters were good, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had positioned their forces to repel a withdrawal, not an assault. Their fields of fire were designed to catch fleeing soldiers, not to stop a direct attack. Morrison's unconventional decision to assault through the strongest point was paying dividends. As the SEALs closed distance with the enemy positions, the nature of the fight began to change. The long-range firefight became a series of close-quarters engagements, where the SEALs' superior training and equipment gave them decisive advantages. Each member of the team was an expert in close combat techniques, and they used every skill they possessed. The intelligence was wrong. The enemy knew we were coming. I could see that your team was walking into a trap, and You what, Sergeant? Morrison's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it. You decided that running away was the appropriate response to a tactical challenge? The words hit Torres like physical blows. He wanted to explain about the fear, about the certainty that they were all going to die, about the overwhelming sense that the mission was compromised from the start. But every excuse he could think of sounded like exactly what it was, the justification of a coward. There's no excuse, sir. Torres finally said, I failed my soldiers and I failed your team. Morrison studied him for a long moment before responding. Your soldiers maintained their professionalism despite your absence. Martinez took tactical command and provided excellent intelligence support throughout our operation. Johnson and Patterson maintained their positions and continued their assigned duties. They performed exactly as trained, even when their leader abandoned them. Each word was precisely chosen to emphasize Torres's failure while highlighting his soldiers' dedication. Morrison was making it clear that the mission had succeeded despite Torres's cowardice, not because of any leadership he had provided. Your failure nearly compromised this entire operation, Morrison continued. We went into that valley expecting coordinated support from an observation team with experienced leadership. Instead, we got radio calls from a scared kid who had to suddenly take command because his sergeant ran away. Torres felt something break inside him as he realized the full implications of his actions. It wasn't just about his own cowardice. His abandonment of duty had endangered the very people he should have been supporting. How? Torres asked quietly.